Oh, good morning to the DME Freeze community, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks on DME for Peace. These Thursday Talks are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground, based in a very humid Washington, D.C. Today, I am delighted to welcome our guest, Michael Cooper of Emergence, who will lead a discussion on blockchain for peace and development, what you need to know. Just a note, you can ask your question throughout the webinar by writing your question in the GoToWebinar dashboard. I'm now not going to take up any more of your time and hand over to our host. Michael, you're very welcome to the Thursday Talks. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Hopefully everybody's got tea or coffee in front of them. I have tea because my voice is a little hoarse this morning because for some reason I scheduled an all-day presentation the day before a webinar, and so my voice is a little tired this morning, so my apologies. But my name is Mike Cooper. I now run a firm called Emergence. I'm based out of Colorado, but I travel all over the world. Our primary partners include the UN, DFID, MCC, State Department, and USAID primarily. I used to work for the State Department in the Conflict Bureau, where I was primarily partnered with the Office of Transition Initiatives within USAID before I went to Millennium Challenge Corporation as a director for policy and evaluation. And after that, I started up Emergence. And Emergence really kind of melds this analytical with the technological, right? We still offer a lot of traditional monitoring and evaluation, independent evaluation, political economic analysis, and program design services to our partners, but we're working increasingly in the blockchain space. And our partners in the blockchain space have been everybody from traditional funders like the UN to funders that are thinking about getting into the space increasingly, as well as startups and non-traditional funders and angel investors and things like that. So for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about just kind of a really basic overview of the blockchain, what it is and its main value adds. This is going to be a very brief overview. We only have 15 minutes, and I 100% anticipate at the end of the discussion, you're still going to have a lot of questions. Feel free to reach out to me, because this is there's a lot of unknowns, uncertainties, and complexities in the blockchain. And so we're going to just try and do a brief overview of that, then dive into a couple quick applications of blockchain solutions in fragility, peace, and security environments. And then lastly, we're going to talk about if you're considering a blockchain solution for your identified problem within your program or within your organization, some of the initial things that you should be thinking about when embarking on that decision making, as well as some reference materials that can help you and that you can take away from this presentation. So the blockchain, what is it? We've all been hearing about it. There's a lot of hype. There's been a lot of discussion within the international development space about the blockchain, and there's a growing consensus that it's not just a fad. The blockchain is more than likely here to stay. We're very, very early in the kind of maturity spectrum of the blockchain. It's still very, very conceptual. We're seeing some early piloting, which we're going to talk about. But I think that the potential is becoming more and more recognized. And so for an increasingly number of experts in the international development space, it's not just a question of whether the blockchain will go mainstream, be applied in a host of different functions across all the different sectors. So it's not just a question of if that's going to happen, but how and when. And we're going to end the presentation with a brief discussion about kind of the industry trends in terms of the blockchain. So what is the blockchain? And that's the second half of this slide. In the end, it's just a ledger, right? But I think to really understand the big value adds of the blockchain, which I've highlighted here in orange, you have to understand the role of ledgers in societies. Banks are really powerful and have a lot of authority because they control the ledger, as do governments. When you think about a supply chain management protocol, a lot of those actors have a lot of influence because they control some type of ledger. And when you have centralized control of a ledger, it lends itself to really corrupt or malicious practices, right? And that's because traditional ledgers, they can be changed, right? We've all worked in Excel spreadsheets and our own data management systems, or whatever your data management system is, which is essentially a ledger. You can change whatever data you want in that ledger, right? In that database. And you yourself have control over it. Therefore, other people can't really see what you're working on, which allows you to go and make those changes for whatever your purposes are. And that's because you are the trusted agent. You're like banks are the trusted agent over their ledgers. Supply chain third-party intermediaries are agents of trust in that supply chain, right? So I want to perform a transaction with you, but I don't know you. I don't trust you. Therefore, we have to go and find these trusted third-party agents like banks. And so my bank talks to your bank. They essentially negotiate the transaction because they are the agents of trust. Well, what the blockchain is a decentralized ledger that is immutable and transparent. So just the way the blockchain is coded, it's immutable because it's you can never go back and change what was previously entered on the blockchain. You just have to enter in a new block. If you want to amend previous information, you have to enter in a new block. And so there's this perfect audit trail with blockchains. And because the blockchain is decentralized, it's transparent to everybody that has permission to view that particular blockchain. And so you can already kind of see the corruption, the mitigation mechanisms that are built into a blockchain that mitigate against different types of corruption, poor service delivery, or some other type of malicious practice that's going on. And that's because the blockchain, it's immutable, it's transparent, and because the blockchain uses cryptology, it shifts the need to have these trusted third parties, these supply chain agents, banks, some types of government services. It shifts the need to trust in those trusted agents to trusting in the math on the blockchain. So I can transact with you, you can transact with me, even though we don't know each other. We can trust each other because we're using the blockchain and the cryptology in the blockchain. So we're shifting from trust in humans to trust in math. And we talked about how this is going to alleviate the need for a lot of those third parties intermediaries, right? Which introduces our last value add of the blockchain that I'm covering today, which is time and cost savings, which we're actually going to see in the next slide when we talk about for some reason, it is not advancing, my slide deck. There we go, my apologies. I'm gonna briefly just cover two quick applications of blockchain solutions in fragile environments. And this kind of helps to demonstrate some of those value adds of the blockchain. Excuse me, let me grab a drink of tea real quick. So the World Food Program in Jordan had a program called Building Blocks. I think for those of us that have worked in refugee camps before, I worked in Iraq and Afghanistan in some refugee camps, there was an intense amount of complexity. Different services and functions are heavily siloed. There's not a lot of coordination, and even within an individual donor, there's a lot of inefficiency due to cost overage or overhead costs, right? Because everything is so siloed. So what the World Food Program did in Jordan is it consolidated a lot of its service delivery functions within Jordanian refugee camps to where it created these efficiencies because they weren't having to go through a lot of these third-party trusted agents that they were traditionally having to go through. And that resulted in a 98% reduction in a lot of those overhead fees. But additionally, it created not only these cost efficiencies, but time efficiencies. And so services were being delivered faster in a more efficient manner. And the beneficiaries were only having to register once to receive those services. They're not having to go to different registration processes for health versus education versus grocery services or something like that. That's similar to what the UNDP and UNDCF did with the government of Sierra Leone in building on the failures of a credit reference bureau, where the government of Sierra Leone tried to issue digital identities to a lot of its vulnerable populations. But it didn't work for primarily logistical reasons. They just couldn't get that many government processes and all those different data management systems to talk to each other and interoperate and deliver an efficient service. And so what they did was they switched to a blockchain, and it created a lot of those efficiencies through the value adds that we've talked about, and they're seeing a lot better results. So again, there's literally hundreds of different types of applications of blockchain solutions in fragile and peace and security context that are being talked about in the space. But just for today, we're just going to cover those two. But in a lot of partners I've worked with, they're kind of searching for, we're thinking about doing a blockchain-based solution, but we don't know where to start. And this I thought was a very useful tool that I could share with everybody today. I pulled this from the USAID Blockchain Primer. It's a reference piece of reference material that we're going to talk about in the next slide. But essentially what this is a decision tree of various questions that you would go through to see if the blockchain actually could be a solution that fits the problem that you have at hand. And I think this is useful for a couple of reasons. One, it's simple, it's action-oriented. Two, it builds on a lot of the learning we already have around finding the solution or the program design that best fits the context you're working in. And that is problem analysis, right? We've all done problem analysis as part of our due diligence for projects and programs. This is the first attempt to apply this kind of lessons learned thinking of problem analysis that we've all done, and it applies it to the blockchain. So not only is this a useful tool in and of itself, but it also demonstrates what a lot of us are working on, where we're taking previous thinking and trying to adapt it to the blockchain to help provide those new guidance tools. So let's say you do go through this decision tree and you're like, well, the blockchain could still be a viable solution. We're not sure. We need more to think about. Here's what I think you should be thinking about. You say the blockchain might fit the problem. Now what do we do? I think that the blockchain it's really being described as a disruptive innovation, right? And we've already alluded to some of the reasons why it could be disruptive, is that it alleviates the need for a lot of the functions performed by previous third parties who, let's be honest, are usually have a lot of power and authority because they are trusted agents. But it also introduces the need for new services and functions, right? And so it has a lot of disruptive potential for both good and bad. And I think that in a lot of the environments that we operate in, which is kind of highlighted by this quote on the left, we have to be very sensitive to the disruptive potential of the blockchain and the environments we work in, because they already are volatile, right? There's a lot of shifting dynamics and power dynamics and things like that. So we need to be sensitive to design and ethics resources, and I list some of those on the right. They include the USAID Blockchain Primer, which we've talked about. The principles for digital development, I am a very strong proponent of. I think that the principles for digital development bring in a lot of those systems thinking and human-centered design based principles into the digital development space that I think are going to be really valuable for blockchain application in the future. GW put out the blockchain ethical design framework, which is it's probably in terms of the international development, it is the first kind of piece of guidance we have on the ethics of blockchain and what we do. And then the last two are Revolution in Trust and Block by Block, both of them by Mercy Corps. A Revolution in Trust kind of gives a brief overview of what the blockchain is, some of its current applications in international development, while Block by Block kind of does a compare and contrast of different types of blockchain platforms. There's lots of different types of blockchains, and there's different types of blockchains because each type of blockchain is built around a specific problem. And so it's kind of understanding the trade-offs associated with these different blockchain platforms, what they can do for you, and the types of problems that they're best suited for. This slide, from working in this space and with some of the partners, it's kind of really been disheartening. There's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there right now, and so I'm actually trying to develop some guidance material for some of my partners now on how to watch out for these blockchain salesmen or snake oil salesmen, especially in the national development space, because we have a bad history with technology-led solutions, right? We have a history of being overly dependent and overly reliant on the technology to drive the outcome without realizing that it's actually people that need to pick up and utilize that technology to achieve the outcome. And so my point is, it's not all coding and technology, right? It's social science. We're still talking about behavior change. So I think that going back to a lot of those digital design principles and ethics that we just talked about, and integrating those into your discussions with blockchain service providers can really help to identify the potential for a more holistic solution, or whether people are just trying to sell coding and programming. There is a need for coders, there is a need for programmers, but I think that that is part of a more holistic solution to whatever the identified problem is. And so I think that that's what I want everybody to focus on. And then my last piece on this is, because there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainties in applying the blockchain for different types of problems, be prepared to pilot, be prepared to test, and be prepared to adapt those early solutions. Have really iterative, problem-driven M&E frameworks to help you with your piloting, your testing, and to inform your adaptations. So this last slide before we get into questions is going to kind of go into an overview of where the industry is as a whole in terms of the blockchain. We've seen some initial piloting from primarily from the World Bank, DFID, the UN, and some of the regional banks, especially in Asia. Excuse me, another sip of tea real quick. But a lot of this piloting has also been done by a lot of smaller organizations with non-traditional funding sources, angel investors, different kind of consortiums and things like that. And so that's kind of we still don't know what the space is going to look like in 2 years, but right now we are seeing a lot of early piloting, and those pilots are scaling fast, both in terms of number, scope, and the different sectors that they are working in. Right now, we're also, and we've alluded to this previously, we're seeing the initial development of kind of guidance materials on how to design, test, and evaluate blockchain-based applications. We are first producing a lot of like general materials and kind of more conceptual materials, but then we're getting quickly to the point where we are adapting these materials to each sector, different types of tailored applications, and we're also integrating some of the initial lessons learned that we're seeing from this initial piloting, which I think is going to be kind of one of the big kind of leap forwards. So in terms of kind of where funders and donors are, this is all, again, just my opinion. This just kind of my own market-based research and things like that. But we're seeing where DFID, the World Bank, UN, and some of the regional banks are putting out RFPs specifically for certain types of blockchain-based applications, whereas some RFPs within the US like from USAID, I've seen several from USAID that are saying we are we're open to the idea of a blockchain-based solution, but we're not specifically calling for one. And so I think that we're just in that weird transition space right now where some are being very specific and some are just being more open. Some RPs are just being more open. But generally, I think it goes back to what we started with, whereas this probably isn't just a fad, it's probably here to stay. And so it's just a question of how and when. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Michael, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. I know there's a lot of great information in your slides. A reminder to today's audience, we are recording today's webinar. I know it will be posted on the DME for Peace Media Gallery later this afternoon. We're now going to open up today's presentation to questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the leading webinar in peace building, the Thursday Talks. Slightly embarrassing plug there, but you can submit a question one of two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, which allows you to type your question. The second is to click on the little hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask you submit your name and affiliation. Like I said, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so that those who are not able to join us this time can go back and listen to the presentation, our discussion, and learn from our wider engagement. And one thing before we get started, I know a lot of people on the line today are working with blockchain in sort of the peace building, development, humanitarian space. I would love to hear some of your applications and love to hear some of your thoughts on what we're working on. The questions have been coming in thick and fast, Michael, you'll be happy to know. The first question comes from Pierce Duffel. And Pierce, apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Pierce asks, I see that Emergence, which is Michael's company, is part of the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition. What are some concrete outcomes of that partnership? And what are the incentives and costs associated with membership?
Yeah, so that, excuse me, my apologies. So I think that in terms of like membership and what it means to be in that consortium, I would defer that to Consensus, who is kind of the organizer of that consortium. I would reach out to them. But I think that in terms of what are some of the early kind of functions and applications out of that, you know, Consensus and the consortium has run two incubators thus far where we have taken proposals and worked with the people who submitted the proposals in terms of mentoring them to get to a proof of concept and then to get the actual application. So I think that we have seen some small scale applications of blockchain in this international development, social impact space come out of those, those incubators. But I actually think that the big value add of these early incubators like what we've done with the Blockchain for Social Impact Consortium has been the learning, right? So within that consortium, we've already kind of revisited a lot of our methodologies for what it means to assess and mentor a possible blockchain solution to get it to a proof of concept, to get it to more rigorous evaluation standards and things like that. So I think in terms of the application areas that have come out of those incubators have been everything from refugee populations to agriculture, supply chains, to financial inclusion and things like that. I'm not going to go into specifics, but I think that the learning that has come out of those incubators for me has been invaluable.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Our next question comes from Ted Perlmutter of Columbia University. And Ted writes, beyond the disintermediation issues, does this, which I assume is blockchain, tend to be centralizing or decentralizing? The logic is the latter, but how does it work out in practice?
That's a pretty conceptual question. I'm kind of trying to get my arms around it to answer it in a specific way. I think that, you know, the blockchain, because it is a decentralized ledger and it alleviates the need for some of those third-party trusted agents that we talked about before, when we've applied this in the field, so for example, we actually discussed this, right, in the Jordan refugee camp World Food Program there, where they experienced a 98% cost savings, and because they weren't having to go through third-party banks. They could go and just use all their data and transfer it to partners in the field with having to go through governments and banks and things like that. I mean, I think that there's a case study that's been written up on that, where it actually talks about a lot of those third-party agents that they didn't have to go through, and they itemized them out. And so I think that if you were looking for kind of a more, it almost sounds like they're looking for a political economy answer, if I'm correct. I would go and look at that case study, and then you could go and look at some of those actors who functions were kind of alleviated by the use of a blockchain, and see what their traditional role was.
Great. Thank you, Michael. The next question comes again from Pierce Duffel, who is actually from Consensus DC. And Pierce asks, are there particular blockchain platforms or solutions that you're paying attention to? And are there any that you're avoiding?
So I think that this is where there's this overlap with this discussion around cryptocurrencies. And I'm glad we're getting the chance to bring this up, because I think that cryptocurrencies was the first application of a blockchain, and there's been a lot of speculation in terms of financial investment. There's been very malicious actions going on in the cryptocurrency world, and so I think that a lot of people tend to synonymize blockchain with cryptocurrencies, when the cryptocurrencies are just an application that are on top of the blockchain. The blockchain has thousands of applications. Cryptocurrencies are one. And the reason I introduced cryptocurrencies here is because a lot of times when people ask this question, they're talking about cryptocurrencies, which I don't think that this individual is, right? I think they're raising a very good point that I would respond to, in that I'm actually agnostic about what type of blockchain platform you should use. I think this is where we go back to our previous thinking and our lessons learned in international development of understanding your problem is really important, and that hasn't changed, which is why the blockchain primer from USAID starts with problem identification and unpacking your problem. And then you go and find the blockchain platform that best fits your problem. So this is actually a plug for good problem analysis work, and then good alternatives testing work with the different types of blockchain platforms. Now, having said that, I think that, and I won't go into the details on this, I'll just mention it. I think that the Ethereum blockchain platform, because it introduces the concept and the practice of smart contracts, which has a lot of implications for how we do work in international development in terms of just our own logistics, but also things like results-based financing, has really incredible potential. I would say 90% of the blockchain projects I'm working on are done on the Ethereum blockchain using smart contracts.
Great, thank you very much, Michael, for the detailed answer. The next question comes from Brian Chevalier, who is a grad student at SIT. And Brian asks, do you see a use for blockchain in the gathering of information data during monitoring and evaluation, impact evaluations, for example?
Yes. So Valentin Gandhi, who actually is presented in this forum before, him and I led a workshop at Merletech DC a few weeks ago, where we talked about how the blockchain can be integrated into monitoring and evaluation data management life cycles, whether it's programmatic M&E, whether it's an independent performance evaluation, whether it's an independent impact evaluation. The blockchain can be integrated at different phases of the life cycle of each of those, depending on what the need is. And it can go straight from electronic data collection in the field, and it can be almost instantaneously uploaded to a blockchain. And we're experimenting with different ways to do that using different kinds of public and permission blockchains, using different coding to ensure that personal identification and other sensitive information is protected. So yes, there are applications, and we've already seen piloting of this in both impact evaluations as well as programmatic M&E functions as well. And I should mention this because there is a sensitivity within our field around PII and sensitive information. The blockchain, there's no blockchain has been hacked thus far. And so it's not a question of the security of the blockchain. It's more of a question of how well you prepare the data to go onto the blockchain, because we have to remember the blockchain is not a silver bullet. It's not a magic pill. It's a ledger. It's just a really great ledger with a lot of social implications.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, and I just on that, one of the sort of more emerging parts of the blockchain companies and organizations I've seen recently is blockchain security companies. So sort of they're essentially working to clean the data, make sure that the data is secure when it's on the blockchain.
Right.
Our next question comes from Jennifer Butts, who says, "Great presentation. Thank you very much, Michael. Can you share information on any blockchain programs that have had a gender inclusion element?"
So, I mean, I think that there's been programs that have used the blockchain that have had a gender inclusion piece, right? Where they've had some activities that were devoted towards gender inclusion. I think that I have not worked on them personally, but there have been some blockchain projects that were oriented at financial inclusion, but they were really targeting vulnerable populations, which include women, youth, and the disabled. So I think that a lot of the more gender-oriented projects using the blockchain have perhaps been around digital identity and financial inclusion. I can't think of any off the top of my head, apologies, but always feel free to reach out to me, and we can see if we can't find you some examples or case studies.
Great, thank you, Michael. The next question comes from Prachi Patel from Catalyst Management Services. And Prachi writes, "Blockchain is known to be expensive. How do you think we can make it affordable for smaller organizations?"
I think that it depends on, I think it goes back to what problem you're having, right? And I think that bigger, more complex problems tend to have bigger price tags attached to them to fix them, right? So I think that in terms of cost, I think that the main cost associated with setting up a blockchain solution is actually the kind of overhead to talk through the design components, right? Getting the right people around the table, and then going out and hiring the programmers and coders that can actually write the blockchain itself and develop that interface, right? And I think that that's actually a really key piece to this that I want people to take away, is that, we learned, what was it, the 2015 World Development Report on Mind, Society, and Behavior, which it takes a lot of the lessons that, a field I've worked in a lot, behavioral economics, and applied it to international development. And it underlines the importance of the interface, right, that the beneficiary has. When we think about a lot of the microfinance, when we think about a lot of the like M-Pesa, it's not that the beneficiaries, their main kind of interaction with this project is essentially like an interface on a phone, or it's an SMS, and it's going to be that same type of interface with the blockchain. But the key thing is that what we've learned from behavioral economics and what's emphasized in that World Development Report is that an emphasis on how well that interface being very, very important, right? And getting the design right. So I think that a lot of the cost associated with these early blockchain solutions is working with the programmers, the coders, and getting that interface right to where all people see is an app on a smartphone or they just send an SMS message and it all flows from there.
Michael, I'm seeing quite a few questions asking for a few more examples about how blockchain is being used in sort of development, sort of peace building work. And I was wondering if you might be able to go into detail on maybe, and I know you touched on it briefly during your presentation, but on like a tagging system, for example, with regards to tagging crops or fisheries. I was wondering if you had any examples that you could just elaborate a bit upon to provide our audience with some sort of practical application of the blockchain.
Yeah, so I guess like if we want to stick with agriculture, essentially what the some of the early applications of the blockchain have been to cut out a lot of those third-party agents between small producers and big buyers, right? So a lot of times we've done a lot of international development projects where we've tried to consolidate small producers into a consortium or some type of cooperative so that we achieve an economy of scale that can then go and engage and do business and transact with a big buyer, right? Usually a multinational international buyer that's going to take their product overseas. Now we had to do this because it's too costly for the big buyer to work with the small producer, right? So we have to introduce cost savings to an economy of scale by developing these cooperatives in the consortium. Well, what we've done with the blockchain is that because we experience a huge cost savings, it's now no longer cost prohibitive for a direct relationship between the small producer and the big buyer. And so the small producers aren't paying all those overhead fees to maintain this giant supply chain. It can be a more direct relationship. It doesn't get rid of the supply chain all the way. It just introduces a lot of cost and time savings. But we've also seen the social implications of this, where previously where a relationship didn't exist directly between the big buyer and the small producer, it now exists. And that has direct implications for the price of goods, where the goods are sold, the livelihoods of small producers, etc.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think one of the more interesting things that come from blockchain is this kind of local economies that have been established and sort of these local marketplaces as a result of the blockchain. Yeah, it's really a really exciting development that I think we're only touching upon its potential right now. I guess our next question comes from, sorry, I completely blanked on the question, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit, Michael, on the monitoring and evaluation aspect. Where have you seen the benefits of blockchain when it comes to sort of data upload to data analysis to just around transparency and accountability? How has blockchain been applied in monitoring and evaluation and learning contexts?
In learning contexts, like
Yes.
education? Okay.
Yeah, no, learning as in sort of using the data on the blockchain for decision.
So we've seen some initial applications, but a lot of this are things that we're still thinking about, and we're still thinking about designing and informing some of the early pilots. So if you look at like the Amply project, AMPLY, that was done by UNICEF in South Africa, by IXO Foundation, that's small case IXO, where they used the blockchain as with the Ethereum blockchain with smart contracts as a results-based funding mechanism. So essentially what it was is the teachers take attendance every day, they send an SMS, and that SMS is tied directly into the blockchain. And so whatever data is received by the SMS triggers the results-based payment, right? And so there we have a very simple application, right, of how the blockchain and the weird thing is that there's no human on the other side receiving that SMS, right? The blockchain receives the SMS. So here's this M&E data essentially that's going directly to the blockchain, and with the smart contract loaded on the blockchain, it automatically disperses funds depending on what the SMS says. And so there's no human on the other side. The blockchain automatically does it. And so there's a very simple application. We're developing some of the initial thinking around how to use the blockchain in more complex functions, more complex impact evaluation functions. But there is also very, very big excitement within the M&E space around the potential of the blockchain for access to data, right? The blockchain introduces a lot of potential for automation, especially when you start to talk about the Internet of Things and big data. You know, the blockchain is being presented as the kind of data management tool for big data, just because it lends itself very easily to that. And so imagine if we're able to just get a lot more data and it exists on blockchains instead of more centralized databases. All of a sudden you have a much richer treasure trove of data to do research and monitoring and evaluation on. And some of this could be through automation, right? Like Internet of Things, which we're going to see lower levels of in the developing world, but we're still going to see it. But then also from just more traditional sources, like let's say we used, instead of evaluation catalogs being centralized and controlled, and there's this kind of painstaking process to upload data into them, what if it all existed on the blockchain? And you could still have it somewhat permissioned, you could still have it somewhat public, but there's still an increase in transparency on an increase in overall data availability. And so that obviously has a lot of implications for our field as well.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you very much for your presentation and detailed answers in today's Q&A. I don't know if you want to leave any sort of parting thoughts with today's audience.
You know, I think that as with anything, the best advice when I started to work in the blockchain space was ask questions. I think that the number one defense against, you know, violating a do no harm principle or getting taken advantage of by a blockchain snake oil salesman is just to ask questions, right? If you don't know, just ask. That's been probably the biggest piece of advice that's been value adding for me working in this space. Just because there is a lot of uncertainty and unknowns, and we're all in it together.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. So you heard it here, folks. Be curious. Always ask questions. And personally, I'm very excited to see what the next 5 years look like with blockchain and how it can be directly applied to peace building and development programs. Because to be honest, it looks like we've only just really skimmed the surface. Thank you again to Michael for a fantastic presentation. We're doing back-to-back Thursday Talks basically until the end of the year, so it's really exciting. Join us next week, that's October 11th at 10 a.m. Swati Masar and Joel Turner of IREX host the Thursday Talks to lead a discussion on community-driven approaches to development and how they can foster greater cohesion. If you're interested in that, the link to sign up and register for the webinar is in your chat box right now. We're excited to have you online again with us in the future. Thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Michael, and have a great rest of your week.
Cheers, everybody.